One feature of Cinema that you'll want to acquaint yourself with when modelling are the modelling axis tools. Now you'll find these here in the attributes panel of the Move, Rotate and Scale tool, and we have this tab here that says Modelling Axis. Now currently all of these parameters are greyed out, and that's because I'm in model mode here. Now the modelling axis tools only work with points, edges and polygons, and these are essentially the component parts of this object. So you can see that when I select polygon mode, all of these parameters become available to me. Now, one important thing to understand is that the object that you see here is merely a container for the polygons, edges and points. And the object's coordinate system is completely unrelated to the coordinates of these components. You can actually think of this as a null object that contains its component parts. Now, to give you an example of this and how the coordinate system works, if I were to take this object and place it into a null object, you can see that the cube is now a child of this null, and if I select the cube and move it out of the way, that this is being moved inside the null, and the null's axis position is still at world center. So if I were to rotate this cube, it's moving in its own object space inside the null. Whereas if I were to rotate the null, I get this kind of thing where it's rotating around the null's axis. Now, a very similar thing happens when you are in polygon mode. Let's say I select all of these polygons and I move these polygons out the way, and you can see that the axis is centered in the middle of these polygons, and when I rotate them, they rotate like this. If I go into model mode, you can see that I've essentially moved the geometry inside the container. If I rotate the object, the geometry rotates around the object axis. So let's just go back to where we were before. And if I select all of this geometry, I'm in polygon mode now, you can see that the gizmo is centered in the middle of this geometry, like so. Now the position of the gizmo is controlled by this parameter here that says axis, and it's currently set to selected, so it's going to be in the middle of my selected geometry. Now, if I wanted to rotate this geometry kind of in the way I did before when I rotated the object, I could move this geometry out and I could actually set the axis position to the object's position. Select my rotate tool, and now you can see that I can rotate around the object's axis in component mode. And this would be true as well if I selected world or root or parent. The parent is obviously the object. And I have a bunch of other selections that I can make here as well. But the one you'll probably want to go with is selected for now. So let's undo that. Now I also have another parameter here called orientation, and this controls which way the gizmo is facing. Now currently this is set to axis, and this selection here is actually the axis here, which is set to selected. Now I can control which direction the gizmo faces by using the selections available to me here. Now, if I go to my rotate tool and I rotate the geometry, you'll notice that when I let go of my mouse, the gizmo shoots back to its original position. Now, that's because in selected mode, the gizmo's direction is actually controlled by the object's bounding box. So let me just rotate this way a little bit, kind of zoom out. If I go display and I say box, you can see that this geometry is actually sitting inside a bounding box, and the gizmo is facing the coordinates of this box. We can also see this box in another view by going to model mode, and here we can see the bounding box. Now, oddly enough, if I rotate the object, go back into polygon mode, we can see that the gizmo is now facing in the direction of the object, or the object's bounding box. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you're rotating your polygons and the axis keeps snapping back, that's why that is. Now you can actually make the axis direction stick by hitting the Retain Changes button here, and when you rotate the geometry, the axis direction will actually stick with that geometry. And if you release this, it'll obviously snap back to the bounding box. Now, probably the most useful part of all this is the fact that you can offset the position of your gizmo using these three sliders. So currently I'm rotating this geometry around the center of all these selected polygons. Now, what happens if I wanted to rotate them around this face? Well, what I can just do is offset my gizmo on the x-axis and then rotate from this surface here. When you do these kind of offsets, it's actually offsetting to the bounding box. So if I rotate this geometry and then offset here, you can actually see that it's offsetting to the bounding box of this object. So again, that's something to bear in mind. So why is this useful? Now let's say I select this polygon. Now we already saw this in our normals video, that if we select one polygon or one edge, the direction of the gizmo is automatically going to point in the normal direction. If I select two polygons, I obviously get what I have selected here. Again, that's something to look out for. It's kind of by the by at the moment. So if I inner extrude this surface here and then just extrude out, grab my loop tool, shift to make this selection here, grab my move tool, you can see that the modeling axis is now centered in the middle of all these polygons. Now let's say I wanted to make this selection smaller. If I scale from the center of this selection, and let's have a look at this in all viewports. If I scale like this, you can see that it distorts this face here because it's essentially scaling from the center, so it's pulling all of these polygons outwards. So what I can actually do here is offset my gizmo with the modeling axis slider here for the x-axis. And now I can butt the position of the gizmo up against this surface. So now when I scale, it's scaling from that position, which allows me to scale this geometry along this surface. Now this can obviously be incredibly useful when you want to scale a detail that's residing on a surface and you don't want to disturb that surface. Now similarly, you can do this with single polygons. Let me just reset that, and you can see that I can move my gizmo up and down this polygon. So let's say I were to disconnect this polygon and then I wanted to rotate it from this top edge. At the moment, if I rotate it, it's rotating from the center of the polygon, so I would just put the y-axis up to the top. Then I can rotate like so. Say I reattach this, I can now sort of rotate this surface from any given point on the polygon. Now the object equivalent of all this, if I go into object mode, can actually be found here in the Axis Center tool. It's not quite as interactive, but I could offset my axis along the Z-axis like this and hit execute. And now if I want to rotate my object like that, I can do it from there. And just hit reset and execute to get it back to the middle. Now I can actually do this another way with the axis modification tool, which is L. And if I hit L, I can now come in and choose a face or an edge or a point to set where I want my gizmo. So now I have to disable the axis modification tool to actually be able to rotate this. And now I can rotate like so. And then just realign the axis to the middle with the Axis Center tool. So I can actually do this in component mode as well. Let's say I select this face, I could hit L, select this edge, hit L again, and then rotate around like this. So this is actually a really quick way of doing this. And if I want to get back to the center of this polygon, I can just deselect and then reselect to center up again. So here's a quick practical example of how the Modelling Axis tool can help with a modelling conundrum. I have this sort of cube at the bottom. I've extruded out a tube from this. And let's say I want this tube to go round a corner at 90 degrees. And I want a nice curved edge coming round here. And then I can extrude out in this direction. So what I can do is select the top edge loop. I have my rotate tool selected. So essentially I want to rotate from this point right here. So what I can do is just offset the x-axis of my gizmo so it's now sitting on this point. So I want this to rotate at 90 degrees. Let's give ourselves 4 segments. So I could come to my modelling mode, set my rotational snap value at 22.5. So when I rotate and hold shift, this will snap to this value. So what I can now do is just hold command to essentially copy this edge and rotate, hit shift to snap, and now I get my first rotational segment. But you'll notice that the gizmo has now jumped up to halfway up the bounding box of this edge selection. Even edge selections and point selections have a bounding box. So essentially before I make this first rotation, I want to go to my rotate tool and I want to make sure I have retain changes selected. So this will keep the gizmo on this point. So let's do this again. Let's hit command, rotate, hit shift. And now you can see the gizmo is still at this position. And now all I have to do is just do that again. Command, rotate, shift, command, rotate, shift. And now I have a curve at 90 degrees. So now I can uncheck retain changes, reset this, get my move tool, and now extrude out. And now I have the object that I want. Now this saves you having to, make a tube or make this from a primitive and add it in or do anything to do with splines. You can just set your tool up and then easily replicate the same move going round. And when you subdivide this, this should subdivide into a nice smooth curve. Now, there are many more examples of how this can all be very useful, and I'm sure we will encounter that along the way. So that's just a little bit about the Modelling Axis tool and how it can help you out.